If you like our short stories, please like, comment and subscribe for more. Severus Snape learned early that danger rarely announced itself. It crept. It softened its footsteps. It learned the shape of the room before anyone noticed it had entered. By the beginning of 7th year, Hogwarts felt like a place that had stopped pretending it was safe. The corridors were the same. The portraits still argued. The staircases still shifted with familiar impatience. But the air carried a tension that no charm could disguise. Conversations cut short when professors appeared. Laughter came late, forced, or not at all. Students watched one another more closely, as though waiting to see who would break first. The war had not reached Hogwarts. But its logic had. Snape felt it in the dungeons, where potion work drifted well past the syllabus. In abandoned classrooms, where spells were practiced that left no obvious scorch marks. In the way certain students began to treat harm not as failure, but as calibration. And nowhere was that shift more visible than in James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew. The Marauders had always been reckless. That was not new. What was new was restraint, not moral restraint, but technical precision. Their magic no longer sought attention. It sought effect. Spells were chosen for speed, not spectacle. Incapacitation, not humiliation. They were not playing anymore. They were rehearsing. Snape did not watch them because he hated them. He watched them because he recognized the pattern. He had seen it before, the moment when people convinced themselves they were justified, and therefore unaccountable. When intent became a shield. When harm was excused because it was directed at the right person. What unsettled him most was not Sirius's cruelty or James's arrogance. It was their certainty. They believed they were good. And goodness, Snape knew, was the most dangerous disguise power could wear. He began to observe more closely. Not the boys themselves, but the magic around them. Residue near the Whomping Willow. Fluctuations in ward stability around the Shrieking Shack. The way certain spell signatures reacted strangely during full moon weeks. The data accumulated quietly. That was how he knew it was real. The Marauders' animagus transformations were not neutral. Combined with repeated exposure to lycanthropy, they were creating a feedback loop, subtle, compounding, and catastrophically unstable. Remus Lupin was deteriorating. Not physically. Not yet. But magically. Each transformation took more than it returned. Each month left residue that did not disperse. The containment magic around the shack was compensating, barely. If the pattern continued, something would rupture. And when it did, it would not collapse inward. It would explode outward. Snape understood the implications instantly. The Ministry would not investigate intent. They would not debate loyalty or friendship. They would see an uncontrolled werewolf incident with collateral damage. And Remus Lupin would be executed. Snape did not go to Dumbledore. He knew better. Authority protected narratives, not anomalies. Instead, he went to Remus. They spoke late one evening in an unused classroom, dust motes hanging in the air, the castle quiet in that particular way it only ever was when something waited to happen. Snape did not accuse. He did not threaten. He laid out facts. Patterns. Probabilities. Remus listened in silence. For a moment, a single, fragile moment, Snape believed he had reached him. But fear is not a private thing. It leaks. By the following night, James Potter was watching him differently. Sirius Black no longer laughed when Snape passed. Peter Pettigrew lingered at a distance, eyes sharp, cataloguing reactions. Remus avoided him entirely. They knew. And Snape realized, too late, what knowledge made him. Not a rival. A liability. The logic was simple. Brutal. Wartime. If Snape spoke again, to the wrong person, at the wrong time, everything would unravel. The Ministry. The Order. The fragile illusion that Hogwarts could still pretend it was separate from the world burning beyond its walls. Snape had not threatened them. That was the problem. He had been right. The confrontation came 2 nights later. No audience. No spectacle. No witnesses. A corridor near the Shrieking Shack, where the wards hummed low and the map's blind spots created the illusion of safety. Snape sensed the danger a fraction of a second too late, not because the magic was dark, but because it was deliberate. This was not a prank. It was prevention. The spell was designed to collapse magic inward, to render its target inert. Harmless. Unprovable. It was not meant to kill him. That distinction vanished the moment it was cast. Snape reacted on instinct, countering with unfinished magic of his own, unstable, brilliant, and violent in its refusal to dissipate. The collision tore through the corridor like a scream trapped in stone. Pain detonated through his chest and spine. He hit the floor hard enough to steal his breath, vision fracturing, magic roaring in his ears as though arguing with itself. For one suspended heartbeat, Severus Snape understood something with terrifying clarity. If he died here, the story would say he deserved it. That realization did not break him. It hardened him. When consciousness dragged him back, the corridor was silent. James stood frozen, wand still raised. Sirius's face had gone bloodless. Peter hovered behind them, already calculating escape routes. Remus looked like he might collapse. Snape lay on the stone, breathing shallowly, and knew something they did not yet understand. This moment would save them. And it would damn him. Severus Snape woke to pain that did not behave like pain. It did not spike or fade. It pressed inward, constant and assessing, as though his own magic were deciding whether to continue cooperating with him. Each breath felt negotiated. Each movement came with a faint resistance, like walking through water that remembered being stone. He did not open his eyes immediately. The corridor still smelled wrong. Burned wards. Ozone. Something animal, old and unsettled. Someone was whispering. He's breathing. A pause. That doesn't mean, stop. Snape recognized the voices before he allowed himself to move. James. Sirius. Peter. Remus. All still there. That was interesting. He shifted deliberately, forcing a small sound from his throat. The whispering stopped at once. He opened his eyes to a ceiling he had seen 1,000 times and never expected to be grateful for. James flinched when their gazes met. Sirius looked angry, not at Snape, but at the moment itself, at the fact that something had slipped beyond control. Peter hovered behind them, pale and damp with sweat, already receding into whatever shape would keep him safest. Remus was on his knees. Not dramatically. Not penitently. Just there. Don't move, Remus said quietly. Snape almost laughed. The idea that any of them still believed they were issuing instructions felt absurd. He tried to sit up. Pain flared, sharp and correcting. His magic snarled in protest. Congratulations, Snape rasped. You didn't kill me. No one responded. Snape closed his eyes again, not from weakness but from concentration. The residue was still active. He could feel it, threads of hostile magic knotted together, refusing to separate cleanly. The counterspell he'd thrown had not neutralized the attack. It had fused with it. That was worse. Get away from me, he said. All of you. James hesitated. We should get a professor. No, Snape snapped. The word cut sharper than any spell. You absolutely should not. Silence followed. Heavy. Expectant. Snape forced himself upright, bracing against the wall. His vision swam, then steadied. He took stock quickly, ruthlessly. Multiple spell signatures. Animagus contamination. Lycanthropic instability layered into the residue like a fingerprint that could not be erased. If a professor saw this, they would not see an accident. They would see intent. If anyone investigates this, Snape said, Remus dies first. The words landed like dropped glass. Remus went very still. James shook his head. Dumbledore won't matter, Snape said flatly. The Ministry will. They always do. Sirius stepped forward. Then what do you want? Snape looked at him. The question was revealing. Not what do you need? Not how do we fix this? What do you want? Snape felt something settle in his chest, heavy and cold. I want you to listen, he said. For once. He gestured weakly to the corridor. This magic doesn't fade. It compounds. You created a signature event. It's already stitched into the wards. Peter swallowed. Can you undo it? No, Snape said. But I can hide it. That changed everything. James straightened. Sirius's anger recalibrated into attention. Peter leaned forward slightly, hope flickering where fear had been. Remus closed his eyes. Snape saw it clearly then, the shift from adversary to asset. And the price? James asked. Snape smiled without humor. You already paid it. You just don't realize how much yet. They worked for nearly an hour. Snape directed them with clipped precision, forcing his magic to obey through pain and focus. Suppression sigils layered into the stone. Misdirection woven so delicately it would register as nothing more than old structural enchantments compensating for age. James followed instructions well when he stopped improvising. Sirius struggled. Power without restraint had always been his weakness, but Snape corrected him ruthlessly. Peter stayed silent and did exactly as he was told. Remus watched. When the residue finally dulled, sinking beneath notice, Snape sagged against the wall, exhausted. It won't be perfect, he said. If this happens again, I won't be able to bury it. James nodded quickly. It won't. Snape believed him. That was the bitterest truth of all. This night had frightened them. It had shown them the edge and forced them to look down. They would step back. They would restrain themselves. They would become careful. They would become safe. Snape would not. Here's how this works now, Snape said quietly. You leave. You say nothing. You do nothing. And you? Sirius asked. Snape met his eyes. I absorb the risk. James frowned. That's exactly what it is, Snape cut in. If anyone asks, suspicion follows me. It always does. That's why this works. No one argued. They left without another word. Not out of cruelty. Out of relief. Snape slid down the wall once they were gone, breathing shallowly, the castle settling around him as though nothing had happened at all. He understood something then, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. Surviving had not spared him. It had assigned him a role. The castle adjusted. That was the first thing Snape noticed in the days after the corridor. Not dramatically. Not maliciously. Hogwarts did not punish him, question him, or summon him for explanations that would never come. It simply recalibrated. The stones cooled. The wards settled. The wrongness he had buried beneath layers of misdirection sank deeper, folding itself into the ancient architecture of mistakes the castle had learned to carry without comment. Students passed through the corridor again. They laughed there. Snape felt the echo anyway. Pain lingered, but it was no longer sharp. It had become instructional. His magic responded more slowly now, as though verifying intent before committing. Certain spells resisted him entirely, refusing efficiency unless cast with deliberate restraint. He adapted. He always did. The Marauders changed. Not in the way people noticed. James Potter stopped escalating. His magic remained confident, but it no longer sought edges. Professors praised his maturity. He was trusted more, not because anyone knew what he had survived, but because he now fit the shape of someone who would not disappoint them. Sirius Black laughed again. Loudly. Recklessly. But the laughter arrived with limits. There were spells he no longer cast. Corridors he avoided without admitting why. When anger surged, he swallowed it instead of releasing it. Remus Lupin stabilized. That was the cruelest detail. His transformations evened out. The magical degradation slowed, then halted entirely. Whatever damage had been compounding began to plateau. The castle's wards, reinforced and subtly redirected by Snape's work, held. Remus lived. And no one ever knew how close he had come to dying. Peter Pettigrew attached himself more tightly to James than before. He observed constantly, learning when to speak, when to disappear, when survival meant becoming indispensable and forgettable at the same time. They healed. Snape did not. What followed was not hostility. It was erasure. The Marauders did not mock him anymore. They did not provoke him in class or ambush him in corridors. They did not even watch him with open suspicion. They behaved as though he were no longer relevant. To everyone else, this looked like progress. Growth. Maturity. To Snape, it felt like suffocation. He had become the cost of their restraint, absorbed, unacknowledged, necessary only insofar as silence remained intact. Once, he tried to speak to Lily Evans. Not about the corridor. Not about the spell. He spoke instead about systems. About how people decided who deserved protection and who deserved suspicion. About how easy it was to mistake confidence for morality. She listened. She frowned. "You're seeing enemies where there aren't any," she said gently. "They're trying to do better. Isn't that what matters?" Snape realized then that language itself had limits. The story had already chosen its heroes. And he was not in it. The professors watched him more closely now, not because they suspected him of anything new, but because suspicion had always been part of his shape. He was the student who hovered near dangerous magic, the boy who asked questions without warmth, the one whose brilliance never softened into charm. When something went wrong, a potion misfired, a hex lingered too long, ice drifted toward him first. Snape noticed how quickly narratives formed. James was brave. Sirius was reckless but loyal. Remus was kind. Peter was harmless. Snape was difficult. Suspicious. Intense. No one needed to say it aloud. The roles were understood. He retreated into the dungeons, not in bitterness but in calculation. He refined spells that demanded control rather than force. Potions that punished imprecision. Magic that behaved honestly, brutal when mishandled, elegant when respected. It was there that the questions began. They did not arrive with threats or promises. They came as curiosity. As interest. Older students. Graduates who returned under the guise of visiting professors or family friends. They asked what Snape thought about the war, about the ministry, about power. They did not pretend the world was fair. They did not disguise cruelty as discipline or harm as growth. They said what others would not, that some people were always protected. That some people were always expendable. That pretending otherwise only prolonged suffering. Snape listened. He recognized the tone immediately. Not fanaticism. Clarity. They did not ask him to commit. They did not ask him to swear anything. They simply spoke as though the truth were obvious and waited to see if he would contradict them. He did not. The memory of the corridor returned often, not the pain, but the stillness afterward. The way 5 futures had diverged from a single decision. The way the Marauders had stepped back from the edge and been rewarded for it. Snape had not stepped back. He had learned where the edge was. When the first real request came, it did not feel like a turning point. It felt like continuation. Someone wanted information. Not to attack. Not yet. Just to understand who was moving where, which alliances were forming, how quickly things were escalating. Snape considered refusing. Then he imagined what refusal would accomplish. The request would not vanish. It would simply find someone less careful. So he answered, selectively. He did not lie outright. He clarified. He contextualized. He redirected attention away from volatility and toward containment. No one was hurt. That was the justification. The castle continued breathing. The Marauders continued preparing, unaware of how close their lives had already brushed against catastrophe. Snape felt something settle inside him, not satisfaction, not guilt. Alignment. The world made more sense when one stopped pretending it was kinder than it was. Severus Snape learned the difference between silence and deception the same way he learned most things. By necessity. Silence was passive. It allowed events to unfold without interference. Deception, on the other hand, required intention. It demanded timing, restraint, and a precise understanding of how much truth a system could tolerate before rejecting it. The request that forced him to choose arrived disguised as routine. A professor asked him to stay after class. Not sternly. Not suspiciously. Just long enough to close the door and lower their voice. "There's been an incident," the professor said. "Nothing serious. A hex near one of the stairwells. It dissipated on its own, but the signature isn't standard." Snape understood immediately what that meant. Not dark. Not harmless. Gray area magic, the kind that made institutions nervous because it didn't fit existing categories. "The Ministry has been notified," the professor continued. "We're trying to keep this from escalating." Snape nodded, already mapping the problem. Escalation meant attention. Attention meant patterns. Patterns meant the corridor. "Do you recognize the magic?" the professor asked. Snape did. It was James's work. Controlled, efficient, restrained, the kind of spell someone cast when they believed themselves incapable of losing control. Snape felt the weight of the moment settle. If he told the truth, nothing catastrophic would happen immediately. James would be questioned. The Marauders would be watched more closely. The fragile silence that protected Remus would tighten, strain, perhaps snap. The past would resurface. The corridor would be remembered. If he lied, the investigation would drift. The pressure would ease. The narrative would hold. The Marauders would remain safe. Snape said a name. Not James's. Not Sirius's. Someone adjacent. Someone who experimented openly. Someone who could absorb suspicion without destruction. The professor exhaled, relieved. "That aligns with what we suspected." The investigation shifted. The corridors relaxed again. The castle exhaled. Snape walked away without shaking. That night, he saw James laughing in the common room, future intact. Sirius arguing loudly about strategy, still trusted. Remus sitting quietly by the fire, alive and unaware of how close scrutiny had come. They were safe. Because Snape was not. The realization did not sting. It clarified. From then on, requests came more easily. Not because Snape advertised his usefulness, but because usefulness recognized itself. Information passed through him because it flowed better that way. He understood which truths would detonate and which could be folded neatly into the architecture of acceptable ignorance. He did not fabricate threats. He curated them. The invitation followed soon after, not dramatic, not ritualized. A conversation beyond the wards, where the air felt thinner and the world less carefully arranged. "You already do this," one of them said. "You just don't admit it." Snape did not argue. He thought of the corridor. Of the silence that followed. Of how quickly the world had decided who was worth protecting. "I don't believe in chaos," Snape said. "I believe in systems." They smiled at that. Alignment was acknowledged. Still, there was a moment, one last chance to step away. Information crossed his path through channels that were not dark. A fragment of a plan. A vulnerability. Something that, if shared with the Order, would avert bloodshed. Nothing immediate. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. Snape weighed it carefully. If he warned them, the Marauders' world would remain intact. Their faith in themselves would survive. The war would continue slowly, messily, on terms that preserved comforting illusions. If he did not, events would accelerate. Lines would harden. People would be forced to confront what they were willing to sacrifice. Snape chose not to warn them. He told himself it was strategic. He told himself it would end things faster. He told himself it was inevitable anyway. What mattered was that he chose. That choice did not feel like betrayal. It felt like coherence. From that point forward, Snape no longer drifted between sides. He moved with purpose, translating truths into forms each faction could survive. He became fluent in a mission. The lie did not break immediately. It never does. But it began to demand maintenance. Each silence made the next easier. Each withheld truth reshaped the battlefield in ways that could no longer be undone. Snape understood something then, with a calm that bordered on acceptance. Villainy was not an act. It was a method. And he had learned it well. War did not arrive all at once. It arrived as delays. As missed meetings. As names that stopped appearing on lists. It arrived as gaps, places where people should have been, and were not. Snape learned to read those gaps. He learned which absences were accidents and which were warnings. Which silences meant fear and which meant preparation. The work he had begun, the careful translation of truth into something survivable, became constant. He told himself it was temporary. Everyone told themselves that. The Marauders moved faster now. Trusted more. Included earlier. Their competence, sharpened by restraint, made them ideal for visible work. They were sent where courage was required, where certainty mattered, where success could be seen and celebrated. Snape noticed how often danger curved away from them. A meeting rescheduled at the last moment. A raid delayed by weather that no one remembered forecasting. A rumor redirected just enough to miss them entirely. He did not intervene every time. Only when collapse would have changed the story too much. Because if James fell, the Order would fracture in ways that invited panic. If Sirius fell, anger would replace strategy. If Remus fell, guilt would tear a hole no one would name. Snape told himself this was balance. He told himself that monsters were sometimes necessary to keep heroes alive. The first time he realized how others saw him, it startled him. It happened in a room too small for honesty, where the air smelled faintly of parchment and fear. Someone spoke his name with a mixture of relief and unease. "He'll handle it," they said. "He doesn't flinch." Snape understood then what he had become. Not trusted. Relied upon. There was a difference. Trust implied belief. Reliance implied utility. If he failed, they would not grieve him. They would replace him. The realization did not anger him. It clarified the boundaries. From that point forward, he stopped pretending there would be gratitude. Information flowed through him like water through stone, reshaped, filtered, directed. He learned to give each side just enough to continue without exploding. He prevented disasters no one would ever know had been imminent. He allowed smaller ones through, because pressure required release. He became careful in a way that bordered on surgical. And still, the cost accumulated. There were nights when he lay awake and counted the ways his choices had narrowed. People he could no longer warn. Names he could no longer speak aloud without consequence. Futures that had become incompatible with his continued existence. The Marauders remained unaware. That was not cruelty. It was design. They lived inside a story that required their belief. Their certainty fueled the Order's morale. Their visible goodness anchored others who needed something uncomplicated to stand behind. Snape understood this because he had once believed in something uncomplicated himself. The moment that broke the illusion arrived without drama. A mission failed. Not catastrophically. Not heroically. Just enough to leave bodies where there should have been none. The Order scrambled. Explanations were offered. Mistakes catalogued. Snape watched as responsibility diffused into abstraction. No one asked him directly what he knew. They never did. He realized then that he could tell the truth, all of it, and nothing would change. The story would absorb it, bend it, and continue as before. The monster was no longer optional. It was expected. When he next saw James, there was exhaustion in his smile and steel in his resolve. Sirius burned brighter, anger sharpened into purpose. Remus carried himself carefully, alive and functioning and unaware of how many outcomes had been quietly diverted to keep him that way. Snape felt something like grief then. Not for himself. For the simplicity they would never lose. The invitation to deepen his involvement came as acknowledgement rather than demand. There were no threats. Only understanding. "You're already in too deep," someone said calmly. "You just haven't admitted what that means." Snape did not argue. He had long since stopped mistaking self-deception for mercy. He accepted more responsibility. Took on roles that required him to be precisely what others feared. He became the shape that absorbed consequences the structure could hold. And slowly, imperceptibly, the idea of returning to anything resembling innocence became absurd. He was not trapped. He was positioned. The war did not care how he felt about that. The first death Snape caused did not happen because he was cruel. That would have been simpler. It happened because he was accurate. The information came to him the way it always did now, quietly, without urgency, disguised as background noise that only mattered if you already understood how to listen. A name. A location. A timeline that overlapped too neatly with 3 others to be coincidence. Someone was going to die. That part was inevitable. The question, as always, was who. Snape traced the paths forward with the same discipline he brought to potion making. He removed emotion from the equation not because he lacked it, but because it distorted outcomes. If he warned the Order, the plan would collapse loudly. Panic would spread. Retaliation would be immediate and imprecise. If he warned the Marauders directly, the damage would ripple outward. James would insist on intervention. Sirius would escalate. Remus would follow, because he always did. People would die anyway. Just more of them. Snape chose the narrowest path. He said nothing. The death came 2 nights later, swift, contained, and officially unexplained. The Ministry wrote it off as internal conflict. The Order mourned privately. The name disappeared from conversations faster than Snape expected. He waited for guilt. It did not arrive. What came instead was something colder. Confirmation. The war adjusted around the loss without tearing. Plans shifted. Pressure redistributed. The system held. Snape understood then that his role was no longer theoretical. He was not preventing disasters anymore. He was deciding their size. The Marauders felt the shift, though they could not name it. James grew more serious. Missions became shorter, more focused. He trusted fewer people. Sirius became volatile, brilliance sharpening into fury whenever outcomes did not align with effort. Remus watched both of them closely now, an unspoken anxiety threading through every interaction. They were circling something. Snape saw it in the way James's gaze lingered on him during briefings. In the way Sirius began asking questions sideways, testing reactions rather than seeking answers. In the way Remus avoided him entirely, not out of hatred, but recognition. The distance between what they knew and what they sensed was closing. It was only a matter of time before the wrong thread was pulled. The confrontation did not come as accusation. It came as concern. James found Snape alone in a corridor after curfew, expression carefully neutral, posture deliberately non-threatening. "We lost someone," James said. Snape inclined his head. "War does that." James exhaled slowly. "You knew." It was not a question. Snape considered denying it. He decided against it. "Yes," he said. James stiffened. "And you didn't say anything?" "No," Snape agreed. "Why?" Snape studied him, the man James had become. Capable. Respected. Still convinced the right choice was always visible if you were good enough to see it. "Because warning you would have killed more people," Snape said calmly. James's jaw tightened. "That's not your call." Snape smiled faintly. It already was. The silence between them stretched, thick with everything they had never said. "You're becoming something," James said finally. "Something dangerous." Snape met his gaze without flinching. "I became this the night you decided truth was optional." James recoiled as if struck. Sirius arrived moments later, drawn by instinct or coincidence. He took in the scene, tension snapping instantly into place. "What's this?" Sirius demanded. Snape did not look at him. He had never needed Sirius to understand. James turned away first. That was the moment Snape knew he had crossed a line that did not move. The next death was harder. It involved a name Snape recognized. A voice he had heard before. Someone who had trusted him just enough to believe a mission meant safety. This time, guilt arrived. It sat quietly, heavy and unmoving. Snape did not run from it. He catalogued it. Guilt, he learned, was a poor compass but an excellent reminder. It meant you still understood what you were sacrificing. The Marauders pulled back from him after that. Not openly. Not formally. But the distance became deliberate. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Decisions happened elsewhere. They did not exile him. They insulated themselves. Snape did not blame them. He had taught them how. By the end of the year, it was clear that whatever remained between them was no longer friendship, rivalry, or even mutual utility. It was history. And history, Snape had learned, did not forgive those who understood it too early. There is a moment in every long deception when the lie becomes unnecessary. Not because the truth is safe, but because exposure would change nothing. Snape recognized that moment the night the Marauders stopped pretending he wasn't there. It happened during a briefing that had already gone poorly. Too many voices. Too much certainty. Plans built on assumptions instead of verification. Snape stood at the edge of the room, listening, watching the familiar pattern repeat itself, confidence mistaking itself for foresight. James caught his eye. Not accidentally. deliberately. "You've been quiet," James said. "That's unusual." Snape inclined his head slightly. "You didn't ask." Sirius scoffed. "We didn't need to. We're not walking into a trap this time." Snape felt it then, the shift. Not suspicion, exactly. Something sharper. Expectation. Remus said nothing. He rarely did now. But his attention never left Snape's face. Snape considered his options. If he spoke, the plan would collapse. If he stayed silent, it would proceed, and fail in a way that would cost lives, but not the ones they expected. He chose neither. "That corridor you're avoiding," Snape said calmly, "has been compromised." The room stilled. James frowned. "We swept it." "You swept for what you know how to see," Snape replied. "Not for what you refuse to consider." Sirius bristled. "Are you saying you know something we don't?" "Yes." The word hung there. James held up a hand before Sirius could explode. "Then say it." Snape hesitated. This was the fulcrum. The place where everything balanced. If he gave them the whole truth, the channels, the translations, the lies that had held the war together, the Marauders would break. Not because they were weak, but because belief cannot survive revelation of its own manipulation. They would reject him. They would reject the system. They would try to burn everything clean. And more people would die. Snape spoke carefully. "Change the route," he said. "Delay by 12 hours. You'll still succeed." James stared at him. "That's it? That's all you need?" Sirius slammed his hand against the table. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to decide what we deserve to know." Snape met his gaze. "You stopped deserving it the night you decided some truths were too dangerous to exist." The silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition. James looked between them, understanding dawning slowly, painfully. "You've been doing this a while," he said. Snape did not deny it. "How long?" Remus asked quietly. Snape closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. "Since the corridor," he said. That was the closest he would ever come to confession. The room shifted around them. Chairs scraped. Wands were adjusted unconsciously, not in threat, but in recalibration. James swallowed. "You're saying? You've been shaping things." "I'm saying," Snape replied, "that you're alive because the world bends when someone applies pressure in the right places." Sirius laughed, sharp and humorless. "You expect us to thank you?" "No," Snape said. "I expect you to listen." They didn't. Not fully. They delayed the route. They adjusted the plan. They followed the instruction without accepting the premise. The mission succeeded. No one died. And that was the worst outcome of all. Because success validated their refusal to know more. Afterward, James sought him out alone. "You can't keep doing this," James said quietly. "Whatever you think you're protecting, you're hollowing it out." Snape regarded him with something close to pity. "You think belief survives honesty. It doesn't. It survives simplicity." James shook his head. "You've crossed a line." Snape nodded. "So did you. I just stayed there." They parted without resolution. From that night on, the Marauders stopped circling the truth. They avoided it. Snape understood why. If they named what he was, what he had become, they would have to name their dependence on him. And dependence is harder to forgive than betrayal. The war accelerated. Snape's usefulness increased. And the distance between what he knew and what they allowed themselves to believe became permanent. He felt no triumph. Only inevitability. War, Snape learned, did not reward balance. It punished hesitation. The demand arrived without ceremony. No threat. No ultimatum. Just an expectation delivered in the calm voice of someone who already knew the answer. There was a leak. Not information, loyalty. A channel compromised in a way that would not stay contained. Names would surface. Roots would burn. If the fracture spread, both sides would respond with force, and the casualties would not be selective. Snape was asked to close it. Not delicately. Permanently. He understood the implication immediately. The leak was not a spy in the romantic sense. It was a frightened person, one who had told the truth to the wrong listener and was now panicking, bleeding information in the hope that honesty might save them. Honesty never saved anyone. Snape requested the details. He read them twice. Then a third time, slower. The name was familiar. Not a friend. Not an enemy. A connective thread. Someone adjacent to the Marauders' orbit. Someone who had been useful once and invisible thereafter. Someone whose removal would look like the war tightening, not like a message. Snape did not argue. Arguing implied options. He prepared instead. The meeting took place at dusk, on ground that had learned to absorb mistakes without advertising them. Snape arrived early, arranged the space, tested the wards. He made it efficient. Humane, as much as that word still meant anything to him. When the person arrived, they were shaking. "I didn't mean to," they said. "I thought," Snape raised a hand. "I know. That was the truth." He did. Fear made liars of everyone eventually. He did not draw his wand immediately. He spoke first, not to persuade, not to threaten, but to confirm that the person understood what was happening. Understanding mattered. Panic complicated outcomes. When it was done, it was quick. Snape closed his eyes only after the ward settled. He waited for something to break inside him. It didn't. What came instead was distance, a clean, horrifying clarity that left no room for denial. He had not chosen a side in that moment. He had chosen function. The fallout rippled exactly as predicted. The leak stopped. Retaliation dulled. Pressure redistributed. The war resumed its grim arithmetic without tearing itself apart. Snape returned to Hogwarts under a different kind of scrutiny. Not suspicion. Assessment. People looked at him and recalibrated their expectations. Conversations shortened. Trust became conditional, then unnecessary. He was no longer someone you confided in. He was someone you accounted for. The Marauders felt it too. James noticed the shift first, the way others deferred, the way certain routes closed when Snape appeared. Sirius bristled openly now, anger no longer tempered by denial. Remus grew quieter still, instinctively withdrawing from a truth he could sense but refused to articulate. The consequence they could not escape arrived on a rain-soaked night, abrupt and unforgiving. An operation went wrong. Not catastrophically. Not heroically. Wrong in the way that leaves survivors. James was injured, not gravely, but enough to shatter the illusion of invulnerability. Sirius barely dragged him clear before the structure collapsed. Remus arrived too late to help and too early to avoid blame. The order scrambled. Questions circled. Fear sharpened. Snape had known the operation was compromised. He had seen the pattern hours before it unfolded. He had chosen not to intervene. Not because he wanted James harmed. Because intervening would have exposed too much. James recovered. Slowly. Painfully. Alive. The question lingered in his eyes afterward, not accusation, not yet, but something close to understanding. Snape did not meet it. That night, Snape accepted the final adjustment to his role. Fear, he realized, was not a flaw in the system. It was a tool. Being disliked had protected him before. Being feared would protect him now. He stopped softening truths. Stopped cushioning outcomes. When asked for clarity, he gave it without reassurance. When questioned, he answered without apology. People adapted quickly. They always did. The war pressed on, narrower now, harsher, stripped of illusions that had once made it bearable. Snape moved through it with ruthless consistency, a fixed point around which chaos learned to bend. He did not seek absolution. He did not imagine escape. He accepted, fully, the shape he had become. The corridor at Hogwarts remained untouched. But the price it demanded was still being paid. The truth did not arrive as an accusation. That was the first mistake. If the Marauders had come to Snape angry, he could have managed it. Anger was predictable. It burned fast, demanded reaction, and exhausted itself. He had spent years learning how to survive it. They came to him instead with understanding. James was thinner than he had been before the injury, movements careful in a way that spoke of pain learned too recently to ignore. Sirius looked older, the reckless brightness dulled into something sharper and more dangerous. Remus carried himself with a deliberate calm that Snape recognized immediately. It was the calm of someone who had already reached the conclusion and was bracing for confirmation. They met in a place chosen for neutrality, not secrecy. No wards. No blind spots. No tricks. That, more than anything, told Snape this was not a confrontation meant to end in victory. James spoke first. "How long," he asked, "have you been deciding who lives?" The question was quiet. Controlled. Almost respectful. Snape did not pretend to misunderstand it. "Since the night you decided not everyone deserved the truth," he replied. Sirius let out a short laugh that held no humor. "You mean the corridor?" "Yes." Remus closed his eyes. That single motion carried years of guilt finally given shape. "You let people die," Sirius said. "Yes." "You lied to us," James said. "Yes." "You used us," Remus said quietly. Snape paused at that. "No," he said. "I maintained you." The distinction mattered. James took a breath, steadying himself. "You could have told us. At any point." Snape studied him, the man James had become. Brave. Earnest. Still believing that knowledge automatically led to better choices. "And what would you have done?" Snape asked. James did not answer immediately. Sirius did. "We would have stopped you." Snape nodded. "And in doing so, you would have broken the system that kept you alive." "That's not justification," Sirius snapped. "No," Snape agreed. "It's explanation." The silence stretched. Remus spoke next, voice measured and precise. "The night in the corridor. Was this always where it led?" Snape considered the question carefully. "No," he said. "That night taught me something. Everything afterward was application." James looked at him then, truly looked, not as an enemy, not as an ally, but as something that had grown in the space they had refused to examine. "You became what we were afraid of," James said. Snape's expression did not change. "You became what the world wanted you to be." That landed harder than any spell. "You think this makes you right?" Sirius demanded. "No," Snape said. "It makes me accurate." The truth was fully between them now, bare, unsoftened, impossible to reframe. There was no confession left to extract, no moral high ground remaining to claim. James's voice dropped. "There's a way out." "Dumbledore," Snape shook his head. "This is the part where you mistake mercy for escape." He stepped back slightly, not retreating, just creating space. "I don't get absolution," he continued. "I get utility. That's the trade." "And if we expose you?" Sirius asked. Snape met his eyes. "Then everything you've built collapses with me." They all understood that. The Marauders had become symbols. Anchors. Proof that the war still had clean lines and good men. Exposing Snape would not purify the system. It would poison it. Remus exhaled slowly. So that's it. Snape inclined his head. That's it. James looked at his hands, then back up. You saved us. Yes. And you damned yourself. Yes. Another pause. James straightened, decision settling into place. Then this is where it ends. Snape felt something like relief. Not forgiveness. Closure. You don't speak of me, James said. Not to us. Not to anyone. Snape nodded. I wouldn't. And if we cross paths again? Snape's gaze sharpened. Then we'll do what we've always done. What's that? Sirius asked. Pretend the truth doesn't exist, Snape replied. Because that's the only way it ever survives. They left without shaking hands. Without threats. Without reconciliation. Snape remained where he was long after they were gone, aware with a clarity that bordered on peace that this was the last moment he would ever be seen as anything other than what he had become. Not a villain in the story. But the thing the story required and could not name. History would later insist that Severus Snape's life turned on love. It would be an easy explanation. A comforting one. Something small enough to fit into classrooms and textbooks and the narrow moral frameworks people preferred. History rarely liked structural answers. The war reached its breaking point quietly. Not with a battle, not with an explosion of magic, but with convergence. Too many plans overlapping. Too many contingencies activated at once. The kind of moment where the entire system either held, or shattered beyond repair. Snape felt it before anyone else did. He always did. The information arrived fragmented, dangerous in its incompleteness. A child. A prophecy misheard and overcorrected. A chain of decisions already in motion, irreversible no matter which direction they were pushed. Snape understood immediately what the system demanded. It did not want justice. It wanted continuity. He went to Dumbledore not as a penitent, not as a hero, but as what he had always been, a mechanism. He did not beg. He negotiated. Not for innocence. Not for absolution. For leverage. The terms were precise. Cruel. Functional. Snape would remain what he was, distrusted, isolated, necessary. He would carry blame where blame was required. He would act where no one else could afford to be seen acting. And when the war ended, if it ended, he would not be rewarded. He would be forgotten. Dumbledore understood. That was the worst part. The choices that followed were not dramatic. They were careful. Incremental. Each one narrowing the path until only a single outcome remained plausible. The night the Potters died was not the night Snape lost everything. That had happened years earlier. This was merely the night the cost became visible. Snape did not rage. He did not plead. He absorbed the outcome the way he absorbed everything else, silently, completely, without expectation of sympathy. The Marauders felt it like a fault line shifting beneath their feet. James was gone. Sirius broke. Remus carried guilt that finally had a name. Peter vanished into the shadows he had always been practicing for. And Snape? Snape became a fixed point. Hated. Feared. Necessary. The years that followed were narrower, colder, stripped of any illusion that goodness alone could hold the world together. Snape played his part precisely. He taught with severity because softness created vulnerability. He punished without mercy because mercy, he had learned, was selectively applied and therefore dishonest. Students saw only the surface. They always did. Behind the scenes, the work continued. Information filtered. Threats redirected. Catastrophes reduced in scale if not prevented outright. The war moved toward its conclusion not because it was won cleanly, but because enough damage had been absorbed in the right places. Snape did not live to see gratitude. That, too, was expected. When the end came, it was not grand. Not poetic. Just another calculation resolved. Another outcome stabilized. The boy who would live survived. The story held. And Severus Snape died as he had lived for most of his life, misunderstood, uncelebrated, and essential. Later, when the truth surfaced in fragments, memories viewed without context, revelations stripped of their architecture, people argued about him endlessly. Was he brave? Was he cruel? Was he redeemed? They missed the point. Snape had never been interested in being good. He had been interested in being correct. The corridor at Hogwarts remained untouched. Students passed through it every day, unaware of the futures that had split there, of the moment where heroes stepped back from the edge and a villain stepped forward instead. History preferred clean stories. It remembered the Marauders as symbols of resistance, of loyalty, of courage refined by restraint. And Severus Snape. History remembered him as a problem. Which was fitting. Because problems are what force systems to reveal themselves. And Snape had done that better than anyone.